if you were to compare the Magic Kingdom to Disneyland, which one wins out? Well, if you've been to both, the answer is obviously Disneyland. Not only is there so much more to do, but it has an intimacy and charm that is unique to it. It may be smaller scale, but it's packed with detail in every corner. The Fantasyland dark rides are something that are really missing from its Florida equivalent, and even outside of the Magic Kingdom, why visit the capacity-challenged Hollywood Studios when you can get Galaxy's Edge and a better version of Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway all in the same park along with classics like Space Mountain, Pirates of the Caribbean, or the Enchanted Tiki Room. When you have Disneyland, not even including California Adventure, why visit Walt Disney World at all? Well, despite Disneyland being the better park, there is still a lot that I enjoy about the Florida parks, or at least I will for a short period of time, as Disney seems determined to rip out all of the experiences that made their parks here feel creative and unique. In fact, I really do not understand why people enjoy Epcot at all anymore. They only go specifically for Spaceship Earth and Living with the Land, and everything that made the park unique is either aging poorly, or has otherwise been ripped out to turn the park into a billboard for Disney+, which does seem to be the strategy coming from current management, and will likely continue long into the future. While there is technically more to do at Hollywood Studios today than there was a decade ago, it still really suffers from a lack of capacity, and even the rides it has are mostly considered one-and-dones by me. The park may have transformed, but it also lost a lot of the charm it used to have. While both versions of the park may seem to be themed to movies on the surface, the old park was about celebrating film as art, while also mythologizing the golden age of Hollywood as a unique and worthy nostalgic theme. Now though, the park suffers just like Epcot, as in, it's a place to put Disney brands rather than express any degree of creativity. So those two parks are essentially places that I rarely visit because they're no longer interesting, which leads to the two remaining parks. Animal Kingdom is great for the moment, although Disney has announced plans to ruin one of my favorite rides and turn it yet again into another land based around Disney Plus data. So that leaves the Magic Kingdom, which while highly flawed and not living up to the standards of Disneyland, is still a really strong park in my opinion. That brings me to the reason for making this video though, which is that recently, as in within the last 2 years or so, I've seen this park receive a rather shocking amount of hate online. As in actual vitriol and people saying that's not worth visiting because it is essentially just the worst manifestation of a castle park with the worst versions of a staple ride lineup. I can certainly understand why people would prefer other castle parks to the Magic Kingdom, as even I made the comment in the past that Disneyland's Main Street is so much better detailed that the Magic Kingdom version essentially seems unthemed in comparison. While I haven't been to these other parks, I can understand why someone would prefer something like Tokyo Disneyland for its better maintenance standards, Disneyland Paris for its excessive detail, or even the few unique rides of Hong Kong Disneyland that can't be found elsewhere. Even Shanghai Disneyland, which seems on the surface to be a traditional castle park, was designed to be much larger and has its own unique taste on attractions as well. So, out of the castle parks, I can see why Magic Kingdom could be seen as the weakest, although my issue is that it still seems to get a lot of actual malicious hate thrown towards it, which is completely unwarranted. In fact, despite the issues with the park and wanting it to be better, I think it's actually still the strongest offering at Walt Disney World. There's still a lot of charm to find in its cloned rides, even if better versions are found elsewhere, and there's so many experiences that are unique to it that are definitely worthy of merit. Controversially, I even feel that it contains the best version of some attractions, so while not perfect, I weirdly felt the need to produce a video defending the Magic Kingdom, discussing the aspects of the park that I still really enjoy, and I think are worth going out of your way to visit. So yes, I do think that this is very much the strongest Disney park in Florida, so let's go through the park, discussing its merits and asking what about it causes so much, well, actual hatred. In my opinion, the actual process of getting to the Magic Kingdom is a fundamental part of the experience. There's just something exciting about arriving at the parking lot, taking a tram to the Ticket and Transportation Center, and either taking the ferry or the monorail to the Magic Kingdom. Now, as a local, and as someone who has had an annual pass since 2017, I do actually find the process of getting to the park to be lengthy and inconvenient, but I think it's important to not lose sight of how the average person likely experiences this process. When Disney built and opened the Magic Kingdom, it was obviously done with the intention of creating a resort area around the Seven Seas Lagoon, and aesthetically, the area is great, especially with the 1988 edition of the Grand Floridian. However, the area and transportation was specifically designed around you getting a glimpse of Cinderella Castle as you were traveling, which was intended to evoke a sense of excitement as it teased you with what used to be considered a massive icon. By today's theme park standards, the castle isn't as impressive as it once was, and the new 2020 paint job makes it appear a lot smaller, but it's still iconic, and for the general person who doesn't go often, the tease of the castle is certainly exciting. There's also something to be said about how impressive it is that the monorail travels through the Contemporary, which is just an awesome signature from an era of Disney that really cared about creating cool things just because they could. It's a completely unnecessary novelty, which is what makes it so interesting. So yes, perhaps getting to the Magic Kingdom is inconvenient if you just casually decide you want to go, but for the majority of people experiencing it, the journey is often exciting around or across the picturesque Seven Seas Lagoon. Once arriving at the park though, you're of course met with Main Street USA, which again, I'm disappointed to see that it's not as intimately detailed as what you'll find at Disneyland, but it's still an interesting theme park land, and has a different notable identity through its larger scale. It's generally well themed and has unique elements that I enjoy, one of which is the corner of Crystal Arts, where you'll often find a glassblower creating products for the shop. Another unique highlight is Casey's Corner, which I think a lot of people might be surprised to find out is named after a short from the obscure 1946 Disney film Make Mine Music. While the hot dogs they serve aren't spectacular, they're still a well-established element of the park experience for many people, and there's just something about the baseball-themed interior that really resonates and evokes nostalgia more powerfully than the rest of Main Street. Going in and getting a really mediocre hot dog is for some reason just a quintessential tradition in this park, and it really makes me wish that Main Street had more distinctly themed areas like this throughout its shops and restaurants. Main Street is of course also the first stop of the Walt Disney World Railroad, which has a larger station than the Disneyland version, and even includes an interesting collection of old penny-operated games and mutoscopes. If you go under the station, you'll also find a small exhibit dedicated to railroads, which is informative and worth checking out briefly. It's cool that this is unique to the Magic Kingdom because the Disneyland station otherwise lacks the space to do something here. In general, the experience of the Disneyland Railroad is exceptionally better. In fact, I even have a dedicated video comparing the two, pointing out how there's just so much more to see in the Disneyland version. However, I do want to highlight that the Magic Kingdom does have a cool Frontierland station, and does pass pretty closely to the flooded town scene of Big Thunder Mountain, which is notably interesting. While the rest of the railroad is essentially just a Florida swamp, it's still a pleasant enough ride and is a unique experience, even if less interesting than its Disneyland counterpart. So, is Main Street spectacular? Well, it may not live up to the Disneyland version, but it's still a worthy nostalgic land on its own, one with a lot of charm that's missing from a lot of other non-Disney parks. That being said, let's move into the more interesting areas of the park, because that's where Magic Kingdom really shines. Moving clockwise around the park from the hub, I do want to first highlight that I very much enjoy the size of Magic Kingdom's Adventureland. Unlike in Disneyland, it's much larger and features extensive facades that definitely allows it to feel like a proper land. There's a few highlights here, so first I want to briefly mention the Jungle Skipper Canteen, which while serving very mediocre food, does have a fantastically themed interior that ties into the Jungle Cruise. I also want to say that I enjoy the Swiss Family Robinson Treehouse, which as an attraction definitely feels stuck in 1971, which is part of its charm. In general, I feel that walkthrough attractions are highly underrated, and while it's now outclassed by the Adventureland Treehouse that just opened in Disneyland, I can still appreciate that this older attraction is unique and full of detail. Moving on to the Jungle Cruise, both versions have slight differences in the scenes between Magic Kingdom and Disneyland, which, in my opinion, is enough of a change to make them both worth experiencing. However, the highlight of the Magic Kingdom version, and the thing that I think that makes it better than in Disneyland, is indeed the indoor temple scene. It's short, it's brief, but is also wonderfully atmospheric, and evokes just the right amount of danger without being too scary to terrify little kids. Perhaps the average person will try to write off both versions of this as the same ride, but as someone who likes to analyze detail, I find them both very different. For example, when I visit Universal Hollywood, I often skip a lot of attractions because, other than some small queue alterations, they're essentially the same as what you can find in Orlando. With Disney's Jungle Cruise, however, the differences are subtle, but common enough that they almost feel like completely different experiences to me, and that makes them both worth going out of the way for. Speaking of similar experiences, the Magic Kingdom Enchanted Tiki Room is, well, inferior. I mean, it is essentially the same as in Disneyland, but it lacks the Enchanted Fountain, which was removed when it was converted into the new management overlay, and it never returns with the original version. I will say that I appreciate the difference in pre-shows between the two, as in the Disneyland Courtyard, there's a small show that highlights different South Pacific gods in a comedic way. However, in the Magic Kingdom, the pre-show features two birds, Clyde and Claude, who convey the story of how they stumbled across this Sunshine Pavilion or an Enchanted Tiki Room. I don't feel that one pre-show is better than the other, but I appreciate that they're different, which reinforces my opinion that a lot of what I like about Magic Kingdom is that it's uniquely different from Disneyland, even if the changes are not necessarily better or preferred by fans. Speaking of which, I also really like how Pirates of the Caribbean is recontextualized here with its own little area of Adventureland. While I don't prefer the Spanish colonial aesthetic of the area to New Orleans Square, which really is one of Disney's best lands, I do again appreciate that this is different and unique. As is tradition in the Magic Kingdom, the food at Tortuga Tavern is awful, that is if it's even open, but again, I do like the pirate theming that you can find in here. As far as Pirates of the Caribbean is concerned, I also really appreciate that it has a proper queue. The Spanish fort is well designed, and inside, it's atmospheric and has a lot of notable queue elements that are otherwise lacking in the Disneyland version. I also appreciate the recontextualization, as here you're taking a boat into a cave system under the fort meant for an escape, as opposed to diving under New Orleans and re-experiencing an old pirate's memories. They're both intriguing in their own way. While I think it's pretty clear that the Magic Kingdom version of Pirates is the least interesting, as it's shorter and misses a lot of scenes from both the California and Paris versions of the ride, it is still a primary reason to visit the park. It's a ride that is often disregarded as the inferior version, and while that may be true, it's still a really strong experience on its own. If I can point out a few key differences, then first I want to highlight that if you're comparing it to Disneyland, the actual scenes here are a bit larger, and the reveal of Barbossa's ship is actually a lot more dramatic, as you're dropping directly into the scene rather than just drifting out of the caves. Something that this ride has that no one talks about either is the scents, as when you're moving through the town, the auction scene has a sweet scent, the drunken pirate with the cats has a butterscotch scent, which I believe is meant to evoke the idea of butterscotch rum, and finally when the town is on fire, there's often a burning wood scent. These can be inconsistent and sometimes not very strong, but if I recall correctly, the Disneyland version of the ride lacks these entirely. Scent is one of the most powerful sensory effects that you can use to enhance a ride, and it certainly adds to the experience substantially in the Magic Kingdom version of Pirates. So this ride isn't ever going to win when stacked up to its competitors, but I'm certainly not going to pretend that it's still not one of the best attractions ever built either. When you're leaving Adventureland, moving into Frontierland, a detail that I've always really appreciated is how the Spanish architecture of the Caribbean blends into the Spanish architecture of the frontier. It's something that most people won't notice, but I've always found it to be fascinating with how subtle it is. Like Adventureland, Frontierland in the Magic Kingdom feels like a proper land, rather than a small themed corner like in Disneyland. I don't really have much to say about it other than I appreciate how extensive its facades are. I enjoy Pecos Bill as a restaurant, not because the food is remarkable, but rather for its Western theming. I would also like to point out that I enjoy the seating area themed as a Mexican town under the night sky, which is one of the fun, little atmospheric Disney flourishes of the past that goes underappreciated today. In terms of attractions, when Splash Mountain was open, I did prefer the Magic Kingdom version just because it got you significantly less wet than at Disneyland, which I anticipate will likely be the case once it reopens as Tiana's Bayou Adventure. Big Thunder Mountain, on the other hand, is definitely a lesser experience than its Disneyland counterpart, as the track is significantly rougher, and the scenes are generally less interesting, although some of them are unique to this version, which is a plus. It's also worth mentioning that Tom Sawyer Island is larger and has more to do than Pirate's Lair in Disneyland, and even still has its fort open, which includes some of the oldest sets and animatronics that you can still witness. Judging from how rudimentary they are, I suspect that these sets have probably existed almost completely unchanged since 1971, so it really does feel a bit like stepping back in time. As a child, I didn't really notice the transition from Liberty Square into Frontierland, but here I want to highlight that they're connected in a clever way, which only really adds to how well they blend together. If you start from the Haunted Mansion and travel along the facades on the river to the end of Frontierland, the buildings architecturally reflect the transition from the early American colonies into the architecture of the West, slowly changing from the early 1800s with the diamond horseshoe to represent St. Louis, transitioning to the logs of the Colorado Rockies for the building hosting the Country Bear Jamboree, and advancing west and in time until you reach the southwest theming of Pecos Bill. This isn't just reflected architecturally, but in the building numbers, which designate years as they advance through time. I also want to mention that I appreciate the Country Bear Jamboree for the weirdness that it was, and while Disney has promised that they're going to bring it back and have the bears now singing Disney songs, I'm really hoping that they don't actually ruin it. If so, that'll be a pretty significant loss for the history of this park. Transitioning into Liberty Square, I think that this is actually one of the most underrated lands and is often forgotten because it feels like there isn't much to do. I was considering perhaps doing a more in-depth video discussing the culture and history represented here, so I won't go into too much depth, but I want to point out that I appreciate the colonial architecture and the many callbacks to the American Revolution. The Hall of Presidents is also another underrated attraction, one that is disregarded because people often joke that it's boring, but I very much disagree. In fact, I find it to be a fascinating show because it manages to elevate the office of the President of the United States in a way that isn't partisan. That's a really difficult dance to do, especially when you consider that the office has been inhabited by many outright bad men who are on showcase here, and unlike the sappy 1980s nationalism of the American Adventure in Epcot, the Hall of Presidents has been updated to fit contemporary tastes, as in, it's actually really entertaining, and it evokes a sense of nationalism that's actually quite inspirational without any partisan allegiance. Liberty Square is also notable for its colonial-themed restaurants, and of course, the highlight is the Haunted Mansion, which if compared to Disneyland's version, I think that this is easily the better ride. As a matter of personal preference, while I like the plantation-style house of Disneyland's New Orleans Square, I very much prefer the colonial house of Liberty Square. If you've watched my older video where I discuss the history and culture of the ghost story that inspired the Haunted Mansion, then you might recall just how heavily many of its scenes are based on Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. The colonial facade in the Magic Kingdom definitely evokes gothic horror a lot better than in New Orleans Square, and so that's why I prefer it because it's a lot more architecturally interesting and foreboding. However, if we speak about the ride portion itself, I think that most people will agree that it's just simply executed better. For example, the load station has the Doom Buggies pull up into a hallway in the actual house, rather than the strange black void of the Disneyland version. In Magic Kingdom, the ride also contains additional scenes, which includes the hallway with the changing portraits and the library with the moving busts, both of which are just small queue elements in the Disneyland version. Magic Kingdom also has a scene dedicated just to the piano player, who is otherwise an element of Disneyland's attic, and it also includes the MC Escher-inspired staircase scene, which is absent from Disneyland's mansion entirely. The colonial house is not without its negatives, as I'm really not a fan of the hitchhiking ghosts having been replaced with projections over physical effects, and the Hatbox ghost placement is a really good example of how contemporary Disney destroys theming in favor of merchandise sales. Simply put, he's in the wrong location because the ride makes a point to only have the ghosts reveal themselves after Leota's seance, and the point of the Hatbox ghost is that he exists in the attic because, well, that's where you would store an actual Hatbox, which is part of the gag. Reportedly, the Hatbox Ghost was intended to go into the attic before structural issues were discovered, but since Hatbox Ghost merchandise was selling well in the Magic Kingdom even before his inclusion, I can only conclude that the company is so money hungry that they were willing to break the theming just to attempt to make a quick buck, which, now that I say it, is actually not at all surprising. Still, despite the flaws of this version of the ride, I still think that it's easily better because of its additional scenes, and personally, I very much prefer the scariness of the house facade. if you've been watching my channel for a while, then you might recall a video from a few years ago where I highlighted just how broken Magic Kingdom's Fantasyland is. One of its largest issues that I pointed out is that it lacks the small, pretzel-style dark rides of Disneyland's Fantasyland, which both add charm and capacity to that park. I had quite a few issues to point out and conceptualize some solutions, but for being the main draw to the most popular theme park in the world, I wondered, why is Magic Kingdom's Fantasyland so underwhelming? Well, despite that being the case, and you can go watch that video if you really want to see me dig into the issues of the land, I would rather be mostly positive for this video and highlight the things that I do actually like about it. First, while a lot of people have complained that the Tangled themed bathrooms are a disappointing waste of potential because they could have been a ride instead, I will say that while that would have been cool, the area is pleasant and well themed. Or at least pleasant when it's not a parking lot for strollers and ECVs. Peter Pan as a ride is fine, one that doesn't deserve the wait time it always has, and also desperately needs updates that the Disneyland version received a long time ago. Still, the update to the queue for the new Fantasyland project is pretty cool, and the ride is still a classic, even if it is in need of a few changes. Mickey's Filler Magic is a decent show, one that absorbs a lot of crowds, and despite the poor food quality, I have always at least appreciated the theming and atmosphere of the Pinocchio Village House. Another plus is that it has the windows that look down into the load station of It's a Small World, which is less impressive to me as an adult, but is something that I found to be really cool as a child. Skipping over Small World for now though, I want to mention that the Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh is a decent ride, and while I've had pretty strong thoughts on how Seven Dwarfs Mine Train fails as both an interesting experience and as a coaster, at the very least, it is pretty and adds a bit of kineticism to the area. In general, New Fantasyland is aesthetically very pleasant, ranging from the French mountains with the Beast's Castle to Prince Eric's Castle and the Mediterranean-inspired queue for Journey of the Little Mermaid. The ride, while it has its issues, often seems to get a lot of undeserved criticism thrown towards it, and in my opinion, is a nice opportunity to get into the air conditioning and away from crowds as it often has a pretty minimal wait. It's not spectacular, but essentially acts as a high-budget seat ticket that absorbs parkgoers pretty well. Unfortunately, while New Fantasyland is quite aesthetically appealing, that's about the best that it has to offer. Enchanted Tales with Belle is a decent distraction for kids, and Be Our Guest, while a fantastic restaurant in terms of theming, follows in the Magic Kingdom tradition of just serving incredibly mediocre food. I'm willing to look past the food quality though, because Disney really did manage to create such an aesthetically interesting restaurant, which really makes me wish that many areas of Fantasyland were just as grand and immersive on this scale. If there's one solid strength of Magic Kingdom's Fantasyland though, it is definitely this park's version of It's a Small World. I certainly won't say that it's better than Disneyland's version, as I really appreciate their inclusion of North America as a continent, and their lengthier, more detailed scenes, but what makes this ride interesting is just how different it is across all of the Disney parks. While many elements are shared across the many scenes of these rides, they're all executed in very different ways, and so without getting into the lengthy details about what exactly is different, it's still a big factor in what makes the Magic Kingdom version of this ride unique. For example, between both this park and Disneyland, you can see that the scene dedicated to France features both the Eiffel Tower and cabaret dancers, but the style, perspective, and scene design are very different, making them both interesting in their own way. While I think that most people prefer the grand facade of Disneyland's version to the covered queue and load station of the Magic Kingdom, there is something magically different about this that still has a lot of merit to it. It may not be as grand, but still has its own sense of atmosphere and charm. Another difference, and one that I prefer, is that the Magic Kingdom boats move through an actual waterway rather than just an elevated trough like in Disneyland, which as a relic of the ride is premiered at the 1964 New York World's Fair. There's something about traveling through the connected waterway that makes the Magic Kingdom version feel a lot larger, so while I don't mind Disneyland's trough, this is still a plus. I know this may be sacrilege to many, but I also prefer the ending scene of the Magic Kingdom version as well. In comparison to Disneyland, the scene here has a lot more kinetic visual elements like the hot air balloons, the various rides, and the steamboat that create more distinct and memorable pieces of iconography to latch onto. This isn't to say that Disneyland's finale isn't great, but it's very different and lacks the epic scale seen in the Magic Kingdom. Again, I do prefer the Disneyland version of the ride for many reasons, but what makes the Magic Kingdom great is just how uniquely different its interpretation is. To wrap up Fantasyland, I do consider Storybook Circus to be its own thematic extension, but still firmly part of the land. And while its closest thematic comparison is Disneyland's Toontown, which is easily the more interesting land, I still appreciate Storybook Circus for what it is. I think its largest benefit to the park is not only moving Dumbo out of a crowded area of Fantasyland, but also cloning it to double capacity. It was also built in that era where Disney was experimenting with interactive queue elements of the park, so while the indoor playground probably leads to issues with children not wanting to leave, it is at least a somewhat interesting thematic addition that adds to the queue experience. I'm also a fan of Goofy's Barnstormer, as it's probably the perfect introduction to a coaster for younger kids, offering the right amount of thrill but not being too long. While the theming isn't particularly strong, I always appreciate what's there and how it fits into the circus theme. Otherwise though, Storybook Circus is really just dressing for meet and greets, and while I wish that there was more, perhaps another flat ride or two, I think it's a decently themed area in its own right, even if it's underwhelming when compared to Toontown. Overall, while Magic Kingdom's Fantasyland, the primary reason for visiting the park, is rather weak, I do think that it does have those redeeming elements worth mentioning. At the very least, it does have unique interpretations of other Castle Park attractions, and the new Fantasyland portion works well aesthetically, even if it leaves you wanting more. If there's one place where Magic Kingdom outshines all the other castle parks, it is certainly with Tomorrowland. While not without its problems either, as the theater for Stitch's Great Escape has sat empty for 6 years, and the Tomorrowland Speedway is probably the worst version of Autopia, there are still a lot of redeeming qualities to this land that easily allow it to stand out as the best version. First, the land aesthetically has been slowly going through a refurb for quite a while now, replacing the 90s steampunk elements in favor of something sleek and with a lot more color. Progress is slow, but certainly better than nothing. While once again, I have to mention the absolute poor food quality of Magic Kingdom, I do generally have a positive opinion of Cosmic Ray's Starlight Cafe, just because it includes Sunny Eclipse, who has been rising out of the stage since 1995. The idea of putting an animatronic in a restaurant is an old relic from an era where Disney really cared about delighting you in every corner of their parks, and so even if I don't eat here because it's essentially just chicken strips and overdone burgers, I at least appreciate Sunny as a weird, quirky novelty of the past. Moving on, I want to mention that I casually enjoy Monsters Inc. Laugh Floor and Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin as mid-tier attractions that soak up a lot of park capacity. They're never a bad time, although they are both dated and could probably benefit from being replaced with more interesting or exciting attractions. However, where Tomorrowland really shines is with its classics, and I think the best place to start is with the Carousel of Progress. Obviously, this show isn't a huge draw for most park crowds, but it's certainly highly desirable for parks fans because it's so well made and full of charm. Even the complaints that its ending scene is outdated don't really resonate with me, because while yes, that may be true, that's also part of what makes it interesting. I don't really care that a car phone or voice-activated house appliances are outdated novelties, but I do appreciate the humor and the irony of putting them on display. It's not really important to the attraction to anticipate specific technology anymore, and the priority should be its optimism for progressing everyone's quality of life, which I think it conveys pretty well. So sure, it could use updates, but I'm perfectly fine with the attraction as the classic that it is. Another underrated classic of the Magic Kingdom is of course the People Mover, which really does benefit from its simplicity. It adds a lot of kinetic effect to the land from the ground in conjunction with the Astro Orbiter, the Tomorrowland Speedway, and now Tron, and as an attraction, it's just a pleasant opportunity to sit down and experience the land in some small scenes while not really waiting in line. It's cool seeing into shops and attractions, it's cool to get unique views of Tomorrowland, it's cool to see part of the original Epcot model, and it's cool to travel into the tranquil darkness of Space Mountain. The People Mover is simple and could perhaps benefit from having a few more scenes, but you can't really beat just sitting down and relaxing while a pleasant breeze cools you off. It's unfortunate that Disneyland's People Mover was destroyed, but this is sadly another big plus for Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland. A bit more divisive, however, is the land's two coasters. I won't say that Tron is a bad ride, but it definitely feels very disconnected from the rest of the land. I think that myself and a lot of other people have agreed, though, that Tron is generally underwhelming. It's a lot of flesh and no substance. I'm not angry that it's in Magic Kingdom, mostly because it didn't replace a good ride like Disney usually loves to do, but it's also a clear example of Disney's aggressive mediocrity that plagues its attractions today. It's just fine, and soaks up a decent number of people. However, where I think that things might get controversial is with Magic Kingdom's Space Mountain, as it's my favorite version of the ride. While conceptually similar to pretty much every other Space Mountain, what makes Magic Kingdom so unique and therefore quite thrilling is that, as the first, it was very much designed as a spiritual successor to the Matterhorn bobsleds. I can see why people would prefer Disneyland Space Mountain with its fantastic onboard audio and synchronized projection effects, but what it lacks is the thrilling, almost unbanked turns and sudden, unpredictable drops of Magic Kingdom. It may not be as intense as the inversions of Disneyland Paris' version of the ride, but the strong lateral Gs and frequent uncomfortably close head choppers offer a unique thrill not really found elsewhere. I can also see people disliking the seating, but the single-file low-to-the-ground arrangement really accentuates the chaos. Also, the queue and load area, while not very detailed, at least have a unique sense of atmosphere that is unique to this version of the ride. I can certainly see why most people might prefer Disneyland Space Mountain, especially as it's a more focused, show effect based experience, but in terms of re-rideability, I find that I prefer the Magic Kingdom. Magic Kingdom is certainly not a perfect park, and one where you can find a lot of flaws if you really take the time to look for them. Its Fantasyland is underbuilt and pretty underwhelming. Main Street USA lacks a lot of intimate detail that you'll find at Disneyland. Pirates of the Caribbean is a shortened version of what you'll find elsewhere, missing a lot of iconic scenes. Still, while the flaws may be apparent, I'm still very much a defender of what this park has to offer. I'm of the opinion that it has the best version of the Jungle Cruise, the Haunted Mansion, and at least has a unique version of Space Mountain not found elsewhere. It also has exclusive attractions like the Hall of Presidents and the Carousel of Progress, but while New Fantasyland leaves something to be desired, I don't think that you can really deny what it adds aesthetically. Even if better versions of attractions are found elsewhere, I can still appreciate this park's unique take on It's a Small World, Big Thunder Mountain, or the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh, among others. There's a lot of merit to the most visited theme park in the world, and so I have to ask, why have people chosen to voice actual hatred for it? Well, I can certainly see why people would prefer other castle parks, especially as I prefer Disneyland, and so it makes the Magic Kingdom an easy target, pointing out its flaws when compared to the others. But why do people choose to overlook its positive aspects, when even I, someone who is often cynical about the state of Disney, can find a lot of good things to highlight? Well, I certainly won't blame someone for having Magic Kingdom the lowest on their list, if that's truly their opinion, but I do think that a lot of harsh criticism for the park is just people choosing to be contrarian just to be contrarian. It takes a lot of effort to overlook the positive aspects of this park, and at a time when Disney leadership is attempting to destroy a lot of what made their parks interesting and unique, the Magic Kingdom still stands pretty strong. So, do people really express this weird, vitriolic hatred for the Magic Kingdom just because they can? Yeah, I think it's just a trendy internet thing to do right now, and ultimately, it's not any deeper than that. In writing this script and exploring the park and its attractions, I really just wanted an excuse to talk about the positive elements I like about the park, because that's something that I just don't do very often. I feel that I'm often too focused on the negatives of the Disney company, and while I think that it's justified criticism, I rarely talk about the things that I do like about their parks, and Magic Kingdom certainly deserves to be viewed in a more positive light. So perhaps the next time that you see someone pretending that this is the absolute worst park that they've ever been to, maybe send them this video, because I feel that I made a pretty strong case that the park isn't just great, but often offers unique experiences not found elsewhere, and has a handful of rides and lands that you could argue are the best versions among the castle parks. So that wraps things up, and if you watched through the video and generally agree with the positives I've highlighted, you can do me a favor by leaving a like to give the video more exposure. As always, if you enjoy videos like these, but have not yet hit the subscribe button with bell notification yet either, you can do so now to be alerted to new videos as they release.